All right. Well, I guess we can get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our Voices for Sustainable Fashion webinar. We have an excellent panel lined up for you today, and I'm very excited to introduce them all. But first, I'm just going to introduce myself and our Voices Out of Fashion campaign. So my name is Catherine Horvath. I'm the Voices Out of Fashion campaign associate with PIRG, the Public Interest Research Group. PIRG is a national nonprofit public advocacy organization, and we advocate for the public interest. We have a lot of zero waste campaigns in which we work to reduce plastic pollution. We've passed right to repair legislation that keeps our electronics working for longer and minimizes e-waste. We've passed plastic bag bans in many states, and now we're working to reduce the waste that's caused by the fashion industry in our Waste is Out of Fashion campaign. So just to give a general briefing on the issue itself, the fashion industry right now is producing way more clothing than we're even able to wear. We're now making 100 billion items of clothing every year, which is double the amount that we were producing in the year 2000. And a lot of this increase in production is due to fast fashion. So, fashion used to follow a seasonal calendar, releasing about four lines every year, but now there's micro trends that are popping up every week in culture. So, to keep up with those fast changing trends, brands are having to produce clothing very quickly, and they're producing it, and it's very cheap and low quality. So, this disposable mindset that we're creating and the overproduction is contributing to the fashion industry being the largest growing waste stream in the US. Shockingly, the US produces enough textile waste to fill the Mall of America every 6 days, and that place is very large. And what's worse, about 30% of this clothing is never even sold or worn, and is likely headed to the nearest landfill or incinerator. So a lot of companies are known for burning or throwing away their overstock in order to make way for the new products. And this is the unnecessary waste that our Waste is Out of Fashion campaign is targeting. So we're calling on Forever 21 and other brands to publicly commit to not trash or burn their overstock. So you can click either this link in the chat to sign that petition, or you can also, Celeste, if you could go to the next slide. Perfect. You can also scan that QR code on the left, and that will take you to our petition that you can sign. This is just a letter that's being sent to the CEO of Forever 21, asking them to take this commitment to sustainability. But there are also a lot of other problems in the fashion industry. They're responsible for 10% of our global carbon emissions. They also pollute our air, pollute our water, contribute a lot to the microplastics in our ocean, and much more. But luckily, there is a really broad community around the world that is working to change the industry to become more sustainable through advocacy, legislation, public education, and even changing the industry from within. And some of these leaders are here to speak with us today. And then just so for that QR code on the right, so our webinar stems from our Voices for Sustainable Fashion collection, which you can view by scanning that QR code there on the right, or you can also click this link in the chat. Perfect. A lot of our panelists today have even contributed their own stories to the collection, which you can see online. So while we certainly want to educate the public about the environmental problems caused by the fashion industry and push brands to make more commitments to sustainable practices, we also really want to amplify the stories and the work that people are doing around the world in advancing sustainable fashion. So the collection has gathered stories from teachers, professors, students, models, sustainable fashion designers, and even legislators who are all working in various ways to make the industry more sustainable. So I really encourage you to check out these stories and read through some of the really inspiring and hopeful messages as people describe what motivates them to do this work. And you're able to explore all the great work that people are doing. Perfect. So now I'd just love to hand it over to our first panelist, Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager Dove. and she will be able to introduce herself.
Hi, well, thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to be on this panel and talking about an issue that I really love. So as was mentioned, I'm Sydney Kamlager-Dove. I'm the Congresswoman for the 37th Congressional District, which includes all of the best parts of Los Angeles. We have an incredible creative community in Los Angeles that includes the fashion industry. So yes, I'm an LA girl, but I grew up in New York and Chicago. I also grew up kind of poor. And so I learned about fashion from going to thrift stores with my mother. And I'm a firm believer in continuing that kind of practice. Little did I know that years later, it would become fashionable to be sustainable. So yes, I am here in Congress, but before I was here, I was also in the state legislature in both the Senate and in the Assembly in the state of California, and also worked on these issues. So currently, as a member of, vice ranking member actually of the House Natural Resources Committee, I'm committed to protecting our environment. In fact, I just came back from the floor. We were debating a bill that we're going to be voting on later on today on mining. And really the undercurrent to the bill is mineral extractions and how those things, pollute the water, create particulate matter, create emissions. That makes sense when you talk about mining, but sometimes people have a hard time translating that to the fashion industry. And we know that there are a lot of materials that go into fashion that are not sustainable, they are not biodegradable, and they are not really suitable for our bodies, I think, let alone for Mother Earth. So it is as important for us to talk about the toxins in our lands and in our water and in our air as it is to talk about the things that we put on our bodies. And so actually, I decided to actually get something out of my resale closet and wear it for today's panel. So I will say I've been a proud sponsor of the Fabric Act, which would ensure that garment workers are treated fairly. And I'm hoping that legislation that I'm working on will be introduced soon that also deals with how we can tackle textile waste. That is incredibly important. And there are some good actors out there that are working hard to figure out how to reuse and recycle textiles, but there are also some bad actors out there that are just interested in making fashion on the cheap and are also not that interested in how workers are treated, how children are treated, how they are abiding by laws in our country, regardless of if they're producing outside of the country, and they're not really considerate about the waste that is coming out of the factories where their garments are being produced. So there's so much within this issue and industry that I think we need to continue to uplift and talk about so that we can help folks understand that you can wear great fashion and love great fashion, and it should be sustainable.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Now I will hand it over to Alexa Rocanova, who is the Senior Advocacy Manager with Remake.
Hi, thank you, Catherine, and big thanks to PERC for having me on behalf of Remake. I'm really thrilled to be here today alongside these amazing panelists who are really paving the way for a better fashion system. So I am Senior Advocacy Manager at Remake, and for anyone who's new to our work, we are an advocacy organization whose focus is uniting change makers in the fight for human rights and climate justice in the clothing industry. So the two pillars of our work are education and advocacy, where we create resources to help others understand how the climate crisis and human rights are connected to fashion. And then we also empower our community to activate their collective change-making power to really advocate for a more just, accountable industry. So we do this, for example, by building coalitions and campaigns to push for things like smarter regulation, pay equity, and environmental justice for workers. So in my role, I co-lead our corporate accountability work, engaging brands on their sustainability efforts and labor initiatives, and then developing our annual fashion accountability report, which ranks 52 prominent fashion companies that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the report discusses their progress in the context of fashion's most pervasive issues. And then on the advocacy side, I also coordinate our campaigns centering living wages and worker health and safety, primarily in South Asia. And my motivation for working in fashion kind of came from I never not worked in fashion. So my first jobs were in retail, and I studied and then worked in design throughout my 20s. And I realized pretty early on just how problematic and untransparent the industry really was. The sheer speed of the fashion calendar and seeing how much excess it created. You don't really have to work in fashion to look around and see that we just have too much stuff in this world that we don't need and probably never even really wanted before it was marketed to us. So for me, the longer that I stayed in the industry and was confronted with its many disturbing secrets, the more questions I had. And the work that I do today was really rooted in wanting to understand how this space that I thought I loved and I still love and feel very connected to, how it got to such a destructive place and wanting to know what I can do to make it better.
That's great. Thank you so much, Alexa. Now I'll hand it over to Representative Charlotte Mena from Washington State.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here, and thank you to PERG for having me as well. I'm Charlotte Mena. I'm a state representative in the state of Washington. I represent the 29th legislative district, which includes a lot of the city of Tacoma and a little bit toward our state capital in Olympia. Um, this year, I introduced the Fashion Act, which is very similar and sort of addresses a lot of the themes that I've heard here already, but essentially it would require disclosure for large companies that gross over, I think, something like $100 million in retail sales every year. And so that would really get us to, big companies and sort of get a better understanding of what's going on. But there's a lot of issues at stake here, right? I've heard it said already, but there's toxics, there's labor concerns, there's consumer protection concerns, and then there's, of course, the concerns to the environment, not just because of the large greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing attributed to the fashion industry, but also because of the waste stream. So, this topic became of big interest to me. I have a strong environmental background. We are a citizen legislature in Washington. So in my day job, work at the Washington State Department of Ecology, and environmental protection, environmental justice, and climate justice have been a big emphasis of mine in my first term. So just last year, I worked to pass a couple of new bills to reduce plastic pollution in the environment, as well as to get toxics out of our cosmetics. So we've seen a lot of action, I think, across state legislatures and certainly at the federal level on environmental protection and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in other sectors with a big emphasis on transportation. But it seems like for the first time, there's a growing awareness in the legislature, at least here in Washington, and among the people who serve toward the fashion industry, something that was right under our noses and something that we certainly have the blueprint for as we've decarbonized under other industries. So I'm really excited for this discussion today. I'm really excited to reintroduce that bill next year and hopefully get a lot of great input so that we can make it even more sweeping and address different problems along the process. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Representative. All right, now we'll hear from Samata Pattison, who's the CEO of Black Pearl. And I'll also be dropping in the chat Remake's accountability report from this year as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Pattinson, and as introduced, I'm the CEO of Black Pearl. So we are a cultural sustainability organization, and what that means is that we see sustainability as inherently linked to culture and the perspectives of culture. That means everything from people's beliefs, their values, their traditions, the systems and ways they grew up, the way they see the world through factors like their faith, their age, their race, their geography and where they live, across to like their socioeconomics, like the disposable income they have, and how they understand the world around them through language and education. And we think that's a really important filter and lens to put on things, because until you can understand someone's cultural experience and who they are, then your conversation about sustainability can't truly resonate with them, because you don't know where they're coming from and what they've experienced. We work across fashion, film, and music. I chose those areas and I'm passionate about those areas because I actually feel that they are emotional and emotive connectors between people. People see their clothes as an identity of themselves and who they are in this world. They go way beyond just giving us dignity. They are storytellers of who we are. Music, again, is like a theme tune to our lives. We have relationships with the artists who create our music and we feel an emotional connection to them. And in the same way with the film industry, movies narrate what we see around us and in some cases represent us or don't represent us. So we see these three kind of industries as ways to connect emotionally with people, but also just to do better storytelling. We do that through collaborations. We do it through educational initiatives. We recently just launched the Sustainable Style Guide for Everyone, which is a free resource that really tackles sustainability through these different cultural lenses. There are chapters in there about the relationship between fashion and faith, so that we're not leaving out communities who interact with clothing in particular ways. We touch on things like accessing and connecting with the disabled community. We recognize culture inherently through cultural appreciation and not appropriation, which the fashion industry is quite notorious for. And we just basically push for these perspectives to be included in the conversations, so that we're not patronizing people, we're not speaking down to people and assuming that we are bringing them new information, but rather meeting them where they are and recognizing the inherent information they already have growing up, wherever they've grown up, and just making sure that that is protected. Fashion is a beautiful space to exist in, and I'm excited to be part of this conversation, but I'm glad that we're able to address the challenges within our industry and all of the people it employs and all of the people it affects in a way that is authentic and just not monolithic and too tunnel vision. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Samara. All right, now we'll be hearing from Iris Placida Kornbluth, who is the COO of Everywhere Apparel. Oh, I think you're on mute, Iris.
Sorry about that. Talking to myself. I'm Iris, co-founder at Everywhere. Everywhere is a circularity company that is helping brands re-engineer their supply chains to become more circular. So we tackle things like post-industrial waste throughout the manufacturing process, of which there's a lot of wastage. We also help brands tackle pre-consumer waste, which is unsold merchandise. And we also support brands in processing returns and post-consumer waste items that have been returned to them through take-back programs. So we're mostly working with the brands that are ahead of the curve right now, trying to get ahead of extended producer responsibility regulations and trying to become more sustainable. We've most recently launched a partnership with Coach and the Tapestry Group to support them as a material supplier. Our focus is on cotton to cotton textile recycling, but we do take back all sorts of textiles. And really the DNA of our company is we are a materials innovation company. So we're working on blends and fibers and yarns, as well as fabrics made of 100% recycled fibers, cellulosic fibers, and that are also biodegradable. So we're essentially material engineers. We do a lot of waste conversion, and we produce products out of textile waste.
Great. Thank you so much, Iris. All right. And then last up, we have Amanda Lapham, who is a former advocate with Penn Environment and now is one of the co-founders of sustainable fashion brand Woven.
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. Hey, everyone. My name is Amanda. I am the co-founder of Woven. Woven is a female-founded, climate-neutral certified sustainable fashion brand. We make all of our clothing out of recycled and reclaimed materials. And every year we donate a portion of our profits to environmental nonprofit organizations. We're most known for our bold prints and our multifunctional designs. And we really believe that sustainable fashion doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have to be neutral. It can be really fun, and that everyone can be a part of the sustainable fashion movement. But like Catherine mentioned, prior to being in the sustainable fashion space, I actually got my career started in the environmental advocacy space. I was working as a grassroots organizer for the organization Penn Environment, which is based in Philly, and is also a sister organization to PERG. So this is just a really cool full circle moment for me, and I'm really excited to be here speaking with you all today. But yeah, as a grassroots organizer, I was working to advocate for climate action policies and renewable energy policies in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And it was in 2020, after working on the election and through the pandemic, that I found myself really burnt out from doing activism work full time, but I wanted to find some more creative ways to promote the environmental issues that I really cared about. So I decided to teach myself graphic design, and that's how I got involved with the work at Woven. So as co-founder of Woven, I helped develop our first ever impact reports. Last summer, I designed our first ever sustainable streetwear capsule that was created with 100% reclaimed waste cotton and all utilized hyperlocal manufacturing right here in Los Angeles. Now I run my own creative agency that's working with other sustainable brands to help bring their missions to life. And yeah, something that really motivates me is just this intersection between creativity and activism. I really believe that through working in the nonprofit space and now in the fashion space, that being creative and being artistic is just such a wonderful way to bring more people into the environmental movement. One of my favorite books and concepts of all time is Pleasure Activism, which is coined by the author Adrienne Maree Brown. And it's really just all about how activism can be a joyful experience. It doesn't just have to be another form of work. And I really try to embody that through my design and through working in fashion. And I hope to utilize that to inspire other people to get involved in the movement as well. So yeah, I'm just really excited to be here today and chat with all of you about how we can make a more sustainable fashion future.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Perfect. Well, it was wonderful to hear all of those introductions from our great panel. Now we're going to open it up to questions. So if you do have a question for any one of our panelists or all of them collectively, you can put that in the Q&A and we'll be answering those throughout the webinar. And we also have some prepared questions that we'll be asking of everybody. So our first question is open to all panelists. In trying to develop a sustainable circular economy for the fashion industry, what do you believe is the greatest challenge facing us today?
I guess I'll start and I'll say, I think one of the biggest challenges is that we are addicted to consumption, and we're addicted to consumption on the cheap. And so we have to recondition ourselves to work to curb production and or to be more thoughtful about how we produce and what we produce and actually what is needed. You know, if you're like me, you see videos about the 5 gyres, about the landfills, just about plastics and all sorts of things, you know, filling up our landfills and recognizing that we are running out of space to hold all of this trash. And we still haven't connected all of the dots. It's one thing to say, okay, you know, I'm going to give up single-use plastic. But it's another to say, I'm also going to look at what's happening in my home and what I choose to buy to help clothe me and my families, and how I can be more thoughtful and actually push the industry and legislation to be more responsive to a very existential crisis.
May I? If that's okay. Sorry, I don't want to talk over anybody. I definitely agree that overconsumption is part of the problem when it comes to kind of a sustainable circular economy. But I also just think there's just a holistic misunderstanding about what circularity even is. I think it's come down to so many people about saying, oh, I have this particular thing that I can use again and again and again and again. And so with the fashion industry, we see that manifesting with brands producing items that they say, well, look, you can use this again and again and again, or it's been made from this particular material and that was recycled. So, here's your circular story. But if that is decoupled from the idea that there's overproduction, then essentially for so many people, it's just a secondary revenue stream. So they're not reducing how much they're producing overall. They're just introducing products that have a circular story. And so I think it's really important. And part of the work we've done, I mean, we've worked with artists like Billie Eilish. I developed her fashion and climate programming for Overheated for 2 years in a row. We wrote the Sustainable Style Guide for the Oscars this year and created other resources. And part of what we're trying to do is educate people about what does it mean when we say circularity, and just taking the language from being quite industry centric to stuff that's relatable to other people. This idea, when we worked with a particular artist, he said, look, waste is only waste if you waste it. That is a relatable concept to lots of people. The indigenous communities have a philosophy, or the seventh generation, this idea that how we're living, we have to live in a way that's considerate of the next 7 generations. In Ghana, we have a saying, Sankofa, we have to look back to look forward. So I think there's a part of educating about the complexity of circularity, going beyond just a product to the material health, the material reutilization, the systems within which that thing has been made, renewable energy, water stewardship, social fairness. But there's also a way that we can educate people to make the language something that relates to them in a way that isn't too industry centric, but is just relatable to your kind of average family, or your student, or your well-to-do person, or your person with a low disposable income. And I think fashion can just sometimes make the language very noisy, very complex, with all of these different certifications that people don't necessarily know where to begin. So I think demystifying the conversation can do us all a great service.
Totally. I definitely agree. I think to just kind of expand upon that thought, it's really about implementing this holistic view versus just solutions that operate in a silo. I think it's really great that a lot of big fashion brands and even small fashion brands are starting to implement solutions like resale programs or like take back programs. But that's only as good as, if you're designing for that full circular economy. It's really easy for big brands to be like, hey, look at this awesome stuff that we're doing. We have this take back program now. Look, circular economies are great. But it really goes back to the root of the problem, which you were highlighting, and that's just stuff. We're just producing too much stuff to begin with, and we need to be working on tackling that problem at the very beginning. So I always use this analogy when it comes to fashion with combating other problems like climate change or plastic pollution. The solutions to those problems aren't just about carbon capture or about recycling plastic. It's about stopping the production of excess plastic in the beginning, or stopping the production of CO2 in the beginning, and really tackling the root problem at its source. So it's really great to implement these solutions at the end of life, but we really need to be thinking of this whole circular economy from the design phase. So as a sustainable brand owner and designer myself, that's something that we're doing every day. And last year, even when we were getting to the end of the year, when normally we would release like a new collection or design new products for our customers, we took a look at our inventory and we said, hey, we actually have a lot of stuff that's been sitting in our inventory for years that we haven't even marketed to our customers. Why don't we just reuse that, remarket it, have a new photo shoot or resell it on a new platform, or maybe even like upcycle it and design it in a new way instead of just making new things. I was listening to this podcast the other day, and someone was saying that we have enough clothing right now in existence to clothe the next 7 generations of people, which is just so insane. So I think overall, we just have all this stuff to work with. And as designers, we need to start getting really creative of what we're doing with it, and just stop producing so much. And we definitely need to hold big brands accountable for doing that as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the overproduction point being made here. I think I can provide a unique perspective more from the manufacturer side as a textile producer. I think that one of the biggest challenges right now is that there's very little localized recycling infrastructure in areas where we are generating a lot of waste, including the United States. We don't have the infrastructure here to recycle a lot of textile waste at scale. We also don't have the infrastructure here to repurpose that into accessible materials for most brands. A lot of that infrastructure was taken offshore, like in the 80s and 90s, to different countries. And so I think we have a geographical issue trying to connect the points of where we are creating waste, where it can be processed into fiber, and then where it can be recycled. And it's kind of shifting a lot of the traditional geography of what supply chains look like today, where there are major brands who have been, just running full package production in Asia for decades. So those kinds of shifts are really massive endeavors for the companies that are overproducing and that are creating a lot of waste. And I think it's a big challenge, is just kind of reimagining where this infrastructure sits and how to route things for recycling.
Well, I'll add, and this has been so great. Everyone has something to add to this conversation. And, I've heard a lot of what the industry leaders are saying in this movement. And certainly there's a conversation to be had about individual responsibility. But I also think there's a lot of room here for government to become a partner in this space. As we've taken environmental action and climate action, we of course operate in a free market, but we've often had to put parameters and targets in place, as well as incentives to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. Because we have great actors and great thought leaders, but we also have folks that are, maybe solely focused on their bottom line and solely focused on producing something that is quick and cheap and inefficient. And so I think it is very appropriate, and certainly in partnership with thought leaders and in partnership with folks that are already in the industry and understand it well, to figure out how do we create incentives that will help businesses that are doing well and taking us in the right direction, but how do we also put those parameters on? And one of the things that really comes to mind from what I've heard here already is, we don't necessarily have truth in labeling. And this has been a problem in other industries, but there are folks out there claiming that their, things are sustainable, but they're actually not. And sometimes it's as simple as creating a definition that we all know and understand and is codified in statute to then know if folks are actually meeting that or not. But, there's a lot of claims about, saving X amount of bottles, that went into making, this shirt with polyester, and that may not be reclaimed material. So we're not on the same page. And, in terms of not overproducing on the front end, I think there's things that we can sort of put in parameters on the back end. I heard Iris say something about extended producer responsibility, and certainly those are things worth exploring and talking about and thinking about how do we do something like that without overburdening businesses. Or certainly alternatives. But I do think that there's a role for government to play, and that's what we're trying to do in Washington.
And I'll just add, going back to have the need to have a holistic understanding of the many intersectional challenges that fashion is facing. So going back to brands and their sustainability strategies, we can't really pursue these intersectional issues in silos, as many still do, and we've seen in our own reporting work at Remake. And we've had 30 years of voluntary efforts that haven't really gotten us very far. So it is very promising that we're seeing this wash of regulation for the first time that will hopefully help to check the industry. But it's important that we don't just have legislation that's focused on environmental reporting. We also need mechanisms for joint accountability, where brands are legally liable for their impacts that they have on people and the planet, and as well as access to remedy for those who are harmed and exploited. For instance, the many garment workers all over the world who time and time again don't get paid when brands cancel orders for products that are already made, as we saw with the pandemic, or when a factory unexpectedly shutters and workers are never paid their severance benefits, which is what we call wage theft. So when we talk about environmental justice with workers, imagine if the penalties collected from companies' non-compliance actually flowed back to those frontline communities who make our clothes, but are also experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. And then lastly, I'll just add that underlying all of these issues, of course, overproduction, but also poor commercial practices on the brand's part, where we have this power and wealth imbalance in fashion supply chains that enables companies to dictate these unfair contract terms with their suppliers, who are then expected to remain competitive on prices while shouldering all the costs of maintaining minimum labor rights and environmental standards. So when brands put all the risk onto their suppliers for these things, it not only affects their ability to pay workers fairly, but also to implement the sustainability improvements that are increasingly being asked of them.
That was great. This transitions into my next question, which is mainly for the representatives, but anybody can feel free to answer. What kind of legislation would you propose that would help shift the fashion industry to becoming more sustainable?
I spoke first last time, so I'll let someone else speak first this time.
It looks like Ritmana is trying to unmute, I think. Oh. You can go ahead, Congresswoman, if you have a thought.
Okay, yeah. Technical difficulties always. Well, truth be told, here in Congress, as you all probably see on the news, we're having a hard time deciding what we should be working on. And that's because of the acute dysfunction coming from the Republican Party. You know, as I mentioned, we're just debating a bill that's going to come up that essentially says you can mine wherever other countries can do it for free and they don't have to worry about environmental impacts. We have folks that, Republicans here that say, if you can't see it, it's not a toxin. We are working to protect the rights of dishwashers and laundry machines and refrigerators, and not working to protect the rights of voters or women. And you think I'm joking, but literally there is a Liberty for Laundry Act that we are going to be voting on. So this is a majority that is not interested in the truth, nor are they interested in science. And I can tell you that as a survivor of the Natural Resources Committee. You know, so when I was in the state legislature, I worked on textile reuse and also glass reuse. We know that there are a number of recycling programs I think every county, I'm assuming every state, I'll at least speak for California, has a very robust recycling center. But we also know that the plastics industry was very excited about recycling because it allowed you to continue to purchase. So it was like creating their own circular economy. You keep buying these plastics and all you have to do is recycle them in this bin and we're going to, save the planet. Well, they're continuing to produce and in fact began to produce more. So I actually worked on a complement around reusable glass. So one way to curb production is just how can you extend the life cycle of glass bottles and actually uplift companies that are in the business of washing them and preserving them and then putting them back into the economy. And so I actually began to do that with textiles before I ended up running for Congress. One of the things I learned was, and another panelist mentioned this, is that we do not have the capacity. In many instances, the infrastructure isn't set up to accommodate these evolved ideas around curbing production and dealing with consumption and reuse. I've been walking around telling people, hey, we should be talking more about, textile reuse. And I kid you not, people say, what is that? Well, what do you mean by that? So we have to educate folks about what we're talking about, and then also do the work around uplifting capacity and infrastructure and then subsidizing the good actors while we're sort of penalizing the bad actors. So I've been very invested in doing that here in Congress. Obviously, states want to have their own prerogative to do the things that they want to do. But I think it's very important for the federal government to set some standards that are the floor, not the ceiling, for folks to begin to figure out how they can promote these kinds of policies in their state. The other thing is just like drilling down even to small businesses. How do you incentivize businesses to say, I'm going to expand my archival inventory or my resale inventory, so that, little companies who've already been doing this understand that there's opportunity and there's applause and celebration for those that, have started to do that or are interested in doing it because they have inventory that they haven't been able to get rid of.
Let me jump in, and thank you, Congresswoman, for going first. I was having technical difficulties with my touch screen, so I just went ahead and unmuted early as soon as it started working. But I really appreciate your response, and I couldn't agree more. Whenever we have a federal solution, that is the preferred option, because it will cover all 50 states, and typically, especially with environmental regulation, will give us the space to then, put even more stringent standards upon it, as you said, a floor, not a ceiling. But often, right, there's more will and agreement at the state level, as I'm sure the Congresswoman knows, having served in the state legislature in California. And so we do have some options. We're not powerless. And a lot of times we see states, in coalition. And in this case, New York has a bill, version of the Fashion Act. California has a version of the Fashion Act. I believe Massachusetts does well, and now so does Washington. And when you get really big states with really big economies like California and New York, you can really start to move the trend. So what we introduced in the Fashion Act last year in the state of Washington had disclosure for companies and due diligence, which includes environmental impacts as well as labor impacts. And then we had a mechanism in there for setting new targets in these areas, and an accountability mechanism with the state environmental agency, as well as a private right of action for folks that felt like there was harm. I will say, because, something like online disclosure, when one state does it, takes effect everywhere. We're really hoping to partner with other states. We're hoping to see what Congress can and will move. And we're hoping to see, who is the first state. If the state of New York is well ahead of us and they can create disclosure, then we can focus maybe on adding additional disclosures for toxics or adding something for the waste stream down the line. It's really difficult for states to find that sort of hook in and jurisdiction to be able to regulate what would be a global company or a company with no brick and mortar presence in the United States, or certainly in the state of Washington. But there are ways that we do so, right? We can say, well, any company that does business in Washington, sale, distribution, or manufacturer has to meet these requirements. So we are looking forward to doing our part and to hopefully expanding, what we had in there last year. But it's really going to take a concerted effort from advocates that are active with their state legislatures and their, federal representatives and senators, as well as a multi-state solution to really come together and set a gold standard across the board.
All right, that was great. Thank you both so much. The next question I want to ask is probably lean more towards Iris and Amanda, but we have somebody in the chat asking, we see recycled polyester as being touted as sustainable in the fashion industry, even though polyester is plastic and contributes to microplastics in our water, which is now found everywhere, even in our own bodies. So how can we educate on what are truly sustainable fibers?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a pretty popular statistic nowadays that we're all eating a credit card's worth of plastic a week. I think it's a lot, probably growing. I think that not many people know what polyester extrusion actually is or looks like. And in essence, creating polyester fiber is creating microplastics. You're extruding these very fine pieces of plastic, and then you're chopping them up into like millimeters long pieces. So it is the generation of microplastics. And I think that is, that kind of strong messaging is not present right now in the industry. Recycled polyester is more or less a greenwash. And actually recycled polyester, when you flake down bottle plastic waste, it actually it weakens the material, and it creates a fiber that generates even more microplastics than a conventional polyester fiber that's not made of recycled pop bottles. So our stance at Everywhere is just, polyester shouldn't exist in apparel, and it shouldn't exist in any material that's being regularly or consistently washed. So when we circulate materials through our closed loop system, we do accept synthetics, of course, because they're a large majority of the fibers on Earth at this point. But we always filter them out, and we segregate cellulosic materials like cotton from synthetics. Cotton we introduce into textile to textile recycling pathways, but everything that's blended or synthetic, we will downcycle or create into a product that's a little more stable that won't be washed. So, for example, like an insulation product or a carpet padding product, or a filler that's not, being put in a washing machine every week.
Yes, definitely couldn't agree more. I also just wanted to highlight, for the microplastics and plastics pollution issue when it comes to recycled polyester, is the fossil fuel angle as well. Creating virgin polyester, or even recycled polyester, essentially uses fossil fuels to create it. You need to extract natural gas to create these products. So I think in shifting away from plastic-based fabrics, it not only helps combat that issue, but it also helps us get back to creating fabrics that have a lower carbon footprint as well. And there's a lot of excitement right now. I really think in the next year or 2 to 3 years, next gen bio-based materials are just going to become so much more popular for designers. I think up until now, there's been a lot of challenges for designers to utilize more bio-based alternatives like mushroom leathers, or natural fibers, just because they were a little bit more expensive. But for example, like rPET fabrics, which are these recycled bottle fabrics, which are some of the fabrics that Woven is using in our product lines, those were created in the 90s. And it's been, a few decades since those fabrics were even implemented into the supply chain. And already we've been able to scale those and now move past these plastic-based fabrics and start introducing new, in a way, kind of going back to our roots and going back to more natural materials. Like, we don't need to create all these brand new materials. We have them already in existence, like reclaimed waste cotton or some of the fabrics that Iris, you were mentioning. So I think a lot of the future of sustainable design is not even just about creating new, but kind of going back to the old and utilizing more earth-centric regenerative fabrics and really creating a more generative fashion future.
Awesome. Our next question is from Melissa. She says, thank you for all your work. In your respective visions, what does the future of fashion look like to you on any level, whether it's the supply chain, legislation, retail, advocacy as well?
I'll jump in on this one. I would say that for us as an organization and for me as a person, I think the future of fashion would be more authentic and more representative of just how global the industry is. And I said it at the beginning, but I think almost this single story that we sometimes push about what sustainability is and who can access those solutions doesn't truly reflect the kind of diverse and rich world that we live in. And I would love to see more Global South representatives and perspectives pushed into the conversation. An example of that being that, we talk about the extended producer responsibility. I'm a British-born Ghanaian living in Los Angeles. And so often when I'm in the conversation and say my home country of Ghana comes up, there's now a single story about what that even is, what sustainability means. It is immediately about dumping of apparel in Cantonmento Market and the issue of that. And I think my future of fashion would ensure that we tell the broader story. We talk about the challenges such as the dumping of secondhand and thrifted clothing, and fast fashion, but we also talk about the emerging designers in those countries. We talk about the infrastructural support they need, but we talk about the existing ready-to-wear and luxury sectors in those countries as well. So I think for me, a future is definitely a more authentic and Global South representative. We're currently working on a curriculum that better reflects creatives around the world. I mentor in different colleges and have done Central St. Martin's, FIDM, Berkeley. And I find that often the case studies or the curriculum doesn't necessarily give students the opportunity to learn about raw material innovators, how processes are developed in countries ranging from Lagos and Accra to Tokyo. And so they're learning case studies for brands whose models they can't replicate because they don't have the same infrastructure to live in. So I think that kind of side of it would be great. And I would also love a more honest use of the word collaboration. I think We use it a lot in the fashion industry. We're collaborating with these brands, we're collaborating with these communities, but fashion can inherently be quite competitive and almost IP protecting. And as a result of that, it sometimes shows up as anti-collaboration and gatekeeping. So I would love just a more taking down the veil and more honest communication about how brands are struggling. You go onto companies' websites and you see their corporate sustainability page or the CSR page. And very rarely will you have a list of these are our challenges, these are the hurdles we're facing, these are the solutions we don't yet have. Can you help us? And almost the dream future fashion industry, that communication would be more honest. It would say, this is what we're struggling with, this is what we haven't quite got right. Instead of kind of the packaging of information in a way that can either be inaccurate or greenwashing, let's have some more honesty and humility in the way that we're interacting with our global communities. And finally, because storytelling is such a big part of what we're part of, we'd love to see stories told about that global value cycle. We would love to see more stories centering not just the farmers and the seamstresses and the garment makers. We'd love to see more creative stories being told. We'd love to see more end-of-use stories being told from different parts of the world, different perspectives, bringing in perspectives such as the disabled community, faith-based groups who aren't really finding themselves welcome in the conversation, who aren't seeing solutions for them, plus-size communities, including and representing the fact that we don't have solutions for so many of the problems that we're facing in the industry. So for us, I think it's just a more honest future fashion industry. And I think it's okay to say that we're not there yet, but at least if we can recognize that, then we see the opportunity and potential for something better in the future.
Would anyone else like to touch on that point of where do you hope to see the industry develop and change?
I think there's a lot of exciting things happening right now in resale, and just a cultural reimagination of thrifting and resale. And I love to see it. I personally buy mostly thrifted clothing. A lot of brands are also buying into now peer-to-peer resale of their own products and getting involved. And I think that's a super positive thing. So I think a growing category of resale alongside new brands who are using, 100% sustainable materials is where I see the future of the industry going.
Yeah, I think to just kind of jump on that point, and for the sake of being honest and kind of turning this into almost like a little brainstorm session itself, like I really see the future of sustainable fashion being a lot more collaborative and a lot less competitive. I think there's a lot of opportunity for brands to pool their resources, not only just their knowledge of how to be more sustainable, but literally sharing textiles or sharing waste or combining community and activist efforts to build a more collective future. And that's something that I'm really interested in as well. I think there's a lot of opportunity to implement more like joint buy programs in which brands could work together to make it more cost effective to buy more bio-based materials for their production. Or if they have excess waste, like why don't we all come together and sew our clothing together and create something new with the fabrics that we've already made. So I think there's just a lot of creativity that we can use to be more collaborative. And it doesn't have to be about one brand being the most sustainable brand there is and competing with each other to be the best, most ethical and sustainable businesses out there. I think it's really going to take us taking a step back and being like, hey, how can we do this together to shape the industry as a whole? And ultimately that will make the biggest impact. So if there's anyone who wants to combine forces in radical and weird creative ways, like let's do it. It's time to stop like gatekeeping all this knowledge and trying to be the best we can alone. We have to be the best we can be together.
Yeah, amen to all of that. And going back to Samantha's point of incorporating more global South voices, I would love to see more solutions that authentically engage and consult workers themselves, brands more authentically consulting workers in the development of their sustainability strategies, going beyond like women's empowerment, like one-off women's empowerment programs or women's health programs where they're donating X amount or X amount of Pads and tampons, like where is that really going and advancing sustainability in the industry? And also, I would say brands or employees rather using their advocacy internally to actually control dialogues within companies to try and get, your higher ups to consider these things that you care about yourselves. Because at Remake, we know there are so many employees who care about these things. They just need the tools to kind of initiate these conversations and feel empowered to do so.
All right, wonderful. I loved that question and hearing all of your responses. Just for our really quick last question that we have, I want to address this to anybody, but what can we do as individuals and consumers, everybody who's watching this panel, to help move the fashion industry in the right direction?
If I may start, would that be okay? I would say, first of all, consider yourself a citizen instead of a consumer. Because I think even the language of the word consumer, and I've had this conversation with people before, it actually gears you towards a certain action to consume. Whereas if you start seeing yourself as a citizen and part of this global community, then there's an almost kind of there's the responsibility and accountability part that comes with it, but it also brings you in community with others. People consistently seem to think that fashion and the fashion industry is separate and other than themselves. And I think that's because we have experiences or perceptions of what this industry is and how it's made us feel like we're not trendy, we're not this thing. But as citizens who wear clothes, then suddenly that conversation begins and takes a different turn. Second of all, I would say just educate yourself. Like that would be the most important thing. I always say, I do mind, but I don't really judge or mind what you do with the information you have. It's more important to me that you have full access to the information. And that's why education is such a big thing. So educate yourself, like whether it's just getting online and Googling. My journey started with winning a contest, having to turn a dress around for the Oscars in 11 days and having to Google the word sustainable in fashion and figure out what that meant. So just go online and start looking. Look for these campaigns, Who Made Your Clothes, Fashion Revolution, 15% Pledge, because we haven't talked about that, but representation and making sure that all communities have access to enrich their lives, including Black and Brown communities, is part of a sustainable fashion industry. So educate yourself and just finally find a space that resonates with you. Like it might not be the climate conversation. It might not be the plastic conversation. It could be about social justice. It could be about supporting Indigenous designers. Find something that actually hits you where you feel a way about it and commit to fully living in a solution-based way around that subject. I know it's all overwhelming, but if you can find a lane that speaks to you, then follow that lane and it will lead you to other places.
I think to hop onto that too, can't stress enough that your voice and your vote really does matter and makes an impact when you utilize this collectively. Many well-known brands that consumers know and love are still violating human rights on a daily basis. So it's important to hold them accountable. And we can do this, as Samantha said, by raising awareness about the issues that they're a part of and actually calling them out and getting them to care about what their customer base and the general public actually cares about. But also being more discerning with your purchasing power. And then lastly, on the note of education, Remake has so many free resources for this. Like in addition to Remake's Fashion Accountability Report, you can also become a Remake ambassador to connect with our like-minded community of people who are working on these solutions every day, collectively with one another to make change. And then we also have so many free events that you can also find on our website, remake.world. So we encourage everyone to really use these tools and resources as a guide for your action. So I'll just drop in Remake's campaigns page as well, which also has some calls to action for our specific campaigns.
I would just add that your voice is important, your vote is important, but also your purse is important. And so it is always, I think, very strong when you put your, money where your mouth is, and brands respond to that. So find the thing that motivates you and invest in that, purchase that, support that. If it's a small thrift store, if it's a small resale collab, if it's the folks that are in your community that are doing very innovative things with reusing textiles, support them. And if you grow that with enough of your friends, then the fashion industry will take notice. I mean, in Los Angeles, we have a lot of fashion houses. I'm deeply concerned that the larger conglomerates are gobbling up the smaller ones and people don't talk enough about appropriation. I'm deeply concerned that, we're not actually thinking about indigenous textiles and how for generations and generations, folks figured out how to manage environment and climate and working in your clothes for very long periods of time and allowing them to last. And so as we are also trying to figure out how to heal and protect Mother Earth, how do we investigate some of those practices from before and bring them here, which might shut down some larger houses, but that's fine, whatever. But I just encourage you to find places that you can support that share the values that you have when it comes to fashion and invest in those. We have there's a very small resale textile reuse company in South LA. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to make it a habit to go and support this woman. There's like one brown sister and she's trying to get a few more folks. And I'm like, yes, because I would rather support the folks in South LA than go down to the big name, boulevards with the couture, houses that are trying to say that they're involved in this. But those are also things that you look at on people and you say, I can't freaking afford that. And that's not what we're really talking about. So think local, right? Support local and let your purse do the talking for your values. And I certainly believe that the fashion industry will take notice.
That was a great way to close us off. Well, we're right at time. So thank you all so much for dedicating your time to speaking on this panel. I think this was a wonderful discussion. I wish we had even more hours to answer all the questions that we got. But I really appreciate all of you sharing your insight and your expertise on this panel. And to everybody who attended or is watching this afterwards, thank you all so much for taking the time to watch and learn. And also, please use all of the resources that each panelist shared. And you can also read their stories in our collection online. So thank you all. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll be sending out this recording in an email to follow up as well.